The roar of the V8 engine echoed through the suburban street as I maneuvered the 1967 Shelby Mustang GT500 into the driveway. Metallic blue with white racing stripes, just as my father had restored it, every detail meticulously rebuilt by his hands over 15 years of dedicated work. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, savoring the silence that followed. This car wasn't just metal, rubber, and paint. It was my father's voice whispering through time. It was every Sunday afternoon in the garage together, every lesson in perseverance he had taught me, every promise we had made. The front door opened. Walter stepped out first, his face displaying the usual confidence of a successful real estate broker accustomed to controlling every situation. For a brief moment, he didn't register what he was seeing. Then recognition flashed across his face like lightning, draining all color from his features. Behind him, my mother froze in the doorway, her eyes widening as her hand flew to cover her mouth. I could hear muffled exclamations from the brunch. Guests gathered inside the house. "Morgan?" Walter's voice cracked, something I had never witnessed before. "How did you... Is that..." "Hello, Walter," I replied, stepping calmly out of the car he had sold without my knowledge or consent just 3 months earlier. "I thought I'd drop by for a visit. Do you like my new acquisition?" "Actually, it's a reacquisition." I casually leaned against the gleaming body of the car. "You know, there's something special about reclaiming something you thought was lost forever, especially when it was taken from you by someone you trusted." The expression on Walter's face, that mix of shock, shame, and fear, was worth more than the $175,000 it had cost to get my father's car back. My father, Robert Parker, wasn't just a mechanic. He was an artist whose medium was metal and engine rather than paint and canvas. In his workshop in the Portland suburbs, he transformed rusted, abandoned cars into functional masterpieces. His hands, always bearing traces of grease under his nails despite countless scrubbings, performed miracles that made other mechanics shake their heads in admiration. I had been Robert's makeshift assistant since I was 10. At first, just passing. Tools and holding flashlights, but gradually learning to distinguish carburetors from distributors, to tell when a spark plug needed replacing just by the sound of the engine, and to appreciate the unparalleled satisfaction of fixing something broken. "Restoring a classic car isn't just about mechanics, Morgan," he would say as we worked. "It's about preserving history, honoring the craftsmanship of those who came before. Every car tells a story." The Shelby arrived when I was 12. My father brought it home on a trailer, more rust than car, barely recognizable as the legendary I model it was. This is a Shelby?" I asked, circling the wreck with youthful skepticism. My father's eyes sparkled. "Not yet, but it will be. This, Morgan, will be our special project. A 1967 Shelby GT500. Fewer than 2,500 were ever made. When we restore it, it'll be as magnificent as the day it rolled off the factory floor." It became a dual transformation. As the Shelby was brought back to life, I grew from a child into a teenager and finally a young adult. Each stage of the restoration marked chapters of my life. Tracking down the original engine coincided with my first school dance. Rebuilding the transmission happened while I struggled with advanced calculus, and the final paint job was applied. During my last summer before college, our bond over that car transcended words. In the quiet hours of the garage between the clink of tools and the hum of sanders, we talked about everything. Outside that sacred space, we were both relatively reserved. He, the quiet widower raising a daughter alone. Me, the teenager who carried the permanent scent of transmission fluid to school. But together, over the hood of that Shelby, we were eloquent. The diagnosis came a week after my 18th birthday. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. The doctors spoke in months, not years. My father received the news with the same stoic calm he showed when diagnosing a complex engine issue. "We still have work to do, Morgan," was all he said on the drive home from the hospital. "The Shelby needs us." We worked with renewed intensity during his last year. When the chemotherapy sessions left him too exhausted to hold tools, he supervised, from his recliner in the garage, guiding my hands. On his better weeks, we worked side by side late into the night, driven by the silent urgency of those racing against an unrelenting clock. The week of my 19th birthday, we started the fully rebuilt engine for the first time. Its powerful roar echoed through the garage like a triumphant battle cry. My father cried. It was the only time I ever saw him cry through his entire illness. 3. Weeks later, we took the first test drive on the road. He insisted on driving, at least initially. With visible effort, he maneuvered the Shelby out of the garage and onto the neighborhood street. I watched closely as he shifted gears with precision, despite the pain I knew was there. After a few miles, he pulled over at a scenic overlook with a view of the city. We switched places, and under his supervision, I experienced the unparalleled sensation of driving the machine we had resurrected together. "It's yours now," he said, his voice weaker but his gaze intense. It always was, really. Every bolt we tightened, every part we polished, it was my gift to you. "Dad," I started, my throat tightening. "Listen," he interrupted gently. "When I'm gone, a lot of things will change. But this car, it's our story together. Every scratch we fixed, every component we restored. It's tangible, Morgan. Something you can touch and feel when the memories seem too far away." 2. Weeks later, he passed away peacefully at home. Honoring his last wish, we drove the Shelby in the funeral procession, the roar of the engine replacing the words I couldn't form. After the funeral, I faced practical decisions. I had accepted a position as a freelance photojournalist, a passion I had developed alongside my love for mechanics that required frequent travel. Insurance for a 20-year-old driver in a high-performance car was astronomically expensive, and I didn't have a garage of my own in the small apartment I rented. My mother, who had become distant after my father's death, offered what seemed like a sensible solution. "Leave the Shelby in the garage at the house. It's safe there, and you can use it whenever you're in town." I accepted the offer but insisted on formalities. We drafted a simple document stating that the car remained my property, stored there for convenience. I kept the original documents with me, leaving copies in a folder in the garage. For the next 2 years, I built my career, making a name for myself by photographing conflict zones and remote regions. But I always returned for a few days with the Shelby whenever I came home. Driving that car felt like reconnecting with my father, through the steering wheel, the scent of leather, and the feeling of the engine responding to my command, exactly as he had designed it. Then my mother met Walter. At first, it seemed like a positive change. She smiled again, became more present and communicative. Walter exuded confidence and stability, qualities that, in hindsight, would mark the beginning of the end. Walter Simmons transformed our family home even before officially moving in. It started with small changes, new decorative pillows, different rugs. Then entire pieces of furniture disappeared, replaced by contemporary designs that matched his aesthetic vision. My father's worn-out recliner, the one he used to rest in after long chemotherapy sessions, was the first to go. "We need an environment that reflects the future, not the past," Walter explained when I noticed the changes. His voice always carried that smooth, reasonable tone that made any objection seem irrational. The office where my father kept his repair manuals was turned into a tasting room with shelves of expensive wines. Family photos migrated from the main walls to less visible hallways. Even his tools, carefully organized in the garage, were relocated to boxes stacked in the back. The only relatively untouched space was the corner of the garage where the Shelby rested under its protective cover. Even there, I felt Walter's invasive presence, in the way sports equipment began piling up nearby, as if silently sending a message about the priorities of the space. During my visits, I noticed the way he looked at the car, not with admiration, but with calculation. "Must be worth a fortune," he remarked once, analyzing it like a property to be listed. "Seems like a waste just sitting there." "It's not just sitting," I replied calmly. "It's being preserved." Walter smiled in that way that never reached his eyes. Of course. I just think about the space we could free up. A home gym would significantly increase the property's value." Every subsequent visit brought some variation of this suggestion. always framed as sensible advice from someone only concerned about my financial well-being. My mother, now completely under his influence, frequently reinforced his arguments. "You barely use the car, sweetheart," she'd say, "and Walter knows the real estate market. Maybe we should consider his suggestions." The growing tension made my visits shorter and less frequent. I felt like an intruder in the house, where I had grown up, a temporary inconvenience when I showed up. Then came the opportunity that would change everything, a commission to document isolated indigenous communities in the Amazon. 6 months of intense work, practically unreachable except for sporadic contact when I reached larger settlements. Before leaving, I went through my usual routine with the Shelby, checking fluids, battery, tires, and taking it for a short drive to keep everything running properly. I left detailed instructions in a labeled folder. Shelby maintenance, important. "I'll be gone for 6 months, I informed Walter and my mother during my farewell dinner. But Diego from Parker's garage will come by monthly to check on Zayas. The car. "There's no need to waste money on that," Walter immediately replied. "I can easily start it up occasionally. It's just turning the key, right?" His comment revealed his complete lack of understanding of classic cars, but I partially relented. "Diego will still come quarterly. It's already arranged." During my expedition, I completely immersed myself in my work, documenting lives and traditions rarely captured. In the few moments I had access to communication, I received short and vague messages from my mother. "Everything's fine here." Or, "House is in order, don't worry." I returned in May, exhausted but fulfilled. With an impressive portfolio of images and stories, I planned a few weeks of rest before preparing my exhibition. Part of that plan included long drives along the coastal roads in the Shelby, my personal form of meditation and reconnection. The taxi pulled up in front of the family home. I immediately noticed the newly landscaped yard, the freshly painted front door, and the discreet sign reading, "Simmons Luxury Real Estate." The transformation was complete. There was no visible trace that Robert Parker had ever lived there. My mother greeted me with a tense hug. "You're so tanned, and way too thin. Come, I prepared your room." "After I drop my suitcase, I'll check on the Shelby," I said casually. A moment of silence. A glance exchanged between her and Walter, who had just appeared in the hallway. "About that," my mother began, her voice faltering. Walter took over with his usual confidence. "Morgan, we made a decision that benefits everyone. That car was just taking up valuable space and was a fire hazard with all those old fluids." "What did you do?" My voice came out barely audible as my whole body tensed, bracing for the answer. "We sold the car," he declared, as if announcing an achievement. "To a respectable collector who will truly appreciate it. We used the money to renovate the kitchen. Look at the magnificent island we have now." The world seemed to pause for a moment. "You sold my car?" "It was just an old car, taking up space," Walter continued, waving a dismissive hand. "And technically, with no clear documentation of ownership and abandoned on our property for years, it had documentation." I finally found my voice. "We had a signed agreement. All the original papers were in the folder." "We didn't find any documentation," he responded with feigned concern. "We sincerely believed you had lost interest. As a goodwill gesture, we set aside $5,000 for you." $5,000. For the masterpiece my father and I built together. For the car that was easily worth over $200,000. To a serious collector. For the only tangible connection I had left with my father. "This is theft," I said, shaking with rage. "Who bought it? Which collector?" "Morgan, don't be dramatic," my mother interjected, her voice firm but her eyes avoiding mine. It was time to move on. "I have the right to know who has my car. Name, now." Walter sighed theatrically. "Marcus Thompson, in Seattle. But I don't recommend bothering him. It was a completely legitimate transaction, and he's a very respected citizen." I grabbed my suitcase without unpacking. You had no right. That was my inheritance, my connection to my father. And you, I turned to my mother, allowed it. Morgan, please, she pleaded, tears forming. It's not just a car, I said before walking out. It was never just a car. In the taxi, as silent tears streamed down my face, 3 thoughts crystallized with absolute clarity. I had to find Marcus Thompson. I had to get the Shelby back, and Walter Simmons would never understand what he had stolen from me, unless I found a way to show him. The burning outrage soon gave way to methodical determination. If there was one thing my father taught me during our restoration of the Shelby, it was that complex problems require systematic approaches. Your dad would have taken that Walter guy apart, piece by piece, said Diego Rodriguez when I showed up at his shop hours after discovering the betrayal. My father's former apprentice had turned Parker's restoration into a respected establishment, keeping the name as a tribute. That car wasn't meant to be sold. I need your help to find it, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you know Marcus Thompson? Diego nodded slowly. Serious collector from Seattle, only buys the best. If he bought the Shelby, he probably didn't know anything shady was involved. How can I get to him? Thompson rarely shows up at public events. He's extremely private. Diego paused, thinking. But there's a classic car expo in Portland next month. He always sends a few pieces from his collection, even if he doesn't show up himself. While Diego worked that angle, I contacted my college friend Ava Chen, now a newly minted attorney working at a small law firm. Legally, it's complicated, she explained after hearing my story. Without that signed document or the original records, it's your word against theirs. Walter deliberately destroyed them, I argued. Probably, but proving that would be extraordinarily difficult. Ava tapped her fingers on the desk, deep in thought. Cases like this usually drag on for years and cost a fortune in legal fees. I don't have years, and I definitely don't have a fortune. There's another approach, Ava suggested. If we can prove to Thompson that the car was sold improperly, you might appeal to his ethics. Serious collectors care about clean provenance and authentic stories behind their vehicles. That strategy would require evidence Walter hadn't managed to destroy. I tore through my small apartment, gathering anything that could confirm my connection to the Shelby. I found dozens of photographs, my father and I working on the car over the years, capturing every stage of the restoration. I located receipts for specific parts we had ordered. And most precious of all, I found the original restoration journal my father had kept meticulously, documenting every detail of the process, including serial numbers for key components. Diego finally secured a promising lead. Thompson will be attending the Portland Expo in person. Apparently, he's showing off a major new acquisition. The Shelby, I said, feeling a mix of pain and hope. I got you VIP credentials. You'll have access to the private collector's area. Meanwhile, Ava prepared a legal dossier detailing my case, not for a formal lawsuit just yet, but as a persuasive tool in case I could get a meeting with Thompson. The night before the expo, I went over every photo, every document, mentally rehearsing what I would say. This wasn't just about reclaiming legal ownership. It was about conveying the true meaning of the Shelby, something numbers on paper could never truly capture. On the morning of the event, I dressed carefully, professional but not intimidating. I wanted Thompson to see me as an equal, someone who understood the value of historic cars, not just a young woman emotionally attached. The convention center buzzed with enthusiasts and collectors. I made my way to the VIP section, my heart racing as I spotted it in the distance, the unmistakable metallic blue with white stripes, flawlessly displayed under strategic lighting. A small group admired the car, and among them, a man in his 50s gestured animatedly, clearly the proud owner. I approached slowly, taking in every detail. The Shelby was immaculate, every chrome part gleaming, every detail exactly as my father. And I had restored it. A sleek sign read, 1967 Shelby GT500, Concours Restoration, Thompson Collection. Only 2,048 units produced, Marcus Thompson was explaining to his guests. This particular example underwent a meticulous restoration, using only original parts or components manufactured precisely to factory specifications. I waited for the group to disperse before stepping closer. "It's an exceptional restoration," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Especially the rebuild of the 428 Police Interceptor engine with dual 4-barrel Holley carburetors." Thompson turned, surprised by the specific technical knowledge. "You clearly know your Shelbys." "This one in particular," I replied. "The clutch was especially tricky. We had to custom fabricate the pressure spring because the original wasn't available." His expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "We?" "Mr. Thompson, my name is Morgan Parker. Robert Parker was my father. We restored this car together over 7 years. It was his legacy to me before he passed away." Thompson turned a shade paler. "Miss Parker, this is unexpected." "The man who sold you this Shelby had no right to do so," I continued calmly, opening my folder. "He was my stepfather, and he took advantage of my prolonged absence to sell something that was never his." I showed him chronological photos of the restoration, the technical journal, receipts for specific parts. "This bolt here," I pointed to a detail on the hood latch, "has a tiny flaw because my dad let me install it when I was just 13. It's slightly crooked." Thompson examined the indicated spot, then looked back at the photos, his professional demeanor giving way to genuine concern. "Walter Simmons assured me the car belonged to his wife's family, who were liquidating old assets. I paid $175,000. "He lied," I said simply. "And he didn't just steal something valuable. He took the last tangible connection I had with my father." To my surprise, Thompson didn't become defensive. Instead, he carefully went over every document, every photo, asking detailed questions about components and restoration techniques that only the real restorer would know. After nearly an hour, Thompson let out a deep sigh. "Miss Parker, I've acquired dozens of classic cars over the years. Provenance is just as important as the restoration itself. I have no interest in keeping a vehicle obtained through questionable means, even if I acted in good faith." My heart raced. "What does that mean?" "It means we need to talk about how to resolve this situation." He paused, thinking. "Obviously, I made a substantial investment. If we could find some form of compensation." Reality hit me hard. I didn't have $175,000, not even close. My income as a freelance photojournalist barely covered basic expenses. "How much could you raise?" Thompson asked, sensing my hesitation. I did some quick mental math, my savings, possible loans, equipment I could sell. Maybe $60,000, and even that would take time. To my surprise, Thompson didn't dismiss it outright. "I have an alternative proposal. My wife admires your photography. I recognized your name. We're planning a book documenting our entire collection. If you agree to photograph it, we could consider that part of the payment." The offer was surprisingly generous considering the gap in value. Still, I'd need to raise a significant amount. "I'll need a few weeks to gather the funds," I replied, "but I'll do whatever it takes to get the Shelby back." "We'll work out the details," Thompson agreed. "In the meantime, I promise I'll take good care of it." I left the exhibition with something I hadn't had when I walked in: hope. The road to reclaim the Shelby would be difficult, but finally, it felt possible. In the weeks that followed, I became a fundraising machine. I sold expensive photography equipment that I could replace later. I accepted a substantial advance for a photography book I had been putting off. Diego, in a gesture that deeply moved me, offered a generous personal loan. "Your father would have done the same for me," he said simply. "That Shelby belongs to you." Finally, after detailed negotiations, we reached an agreement. I would pay Thompson $150,000, less than the original amount, but still substantial, combining installment payments, with the photography project for his collection. In return, he would immediately transfer the title of the Shelby to me. On the day we signed the agreement, Thompson handed me the keys and all the documentation. "There's something you should know," he said as we finalized the transaction. "Walter Simmons never mentioned the sentimental value or the history behind this car. He described it purely in terms of financial investment." That final revelation only confirmed what I had already suspected. Walter would never understand what he had stolen. To him, it was just metal and machinery, an asset to be liquidated. It was time to educate him. I started the Shelby's engine, the familiar vibration beneath my hands instantly reconnecting me with all the hours my father and I had spent perfecting every component. The plan I had crafted wasn't about revenge, it was about justice and truth. Walter needed to fully grasp the magnitude of what he had done. "Are you sure about this?" Ava asked when I shared my strategy. Confronting him like this might destroy any chance of family reconciliation. "What family?" I replied, adjusting the rearview mirror. Walter destroyed that the moment he decided to erase my father's presence and sell the one thing I asked him to leave untouched. Through discreet conversations with neighbors, I discovered that Walter and my mother were hosting their usual networking brunch the following Sunday, a carefully curated event designed to impress high-profile real estate clients. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The day before, I called Diego for a final checkup on the Shelby. "Everything's flawless," he confirmed after a full inspection. "Your father would be proud, not just of the car, but of you, for fighting for it." "I'm not just fighting for the car," I gently corrected. "I'm fighting for what it represents." On the pivotal morning, I woke before dawn. I dressed deliberately, jeans, a t-shirt, and the worn leather jacket my father often wore in the garage. It wasn't a fashion statement, but a symbol. Carefully prepared a small folder containing all the relevant documents, the new paperwork confirming my ownership, photographs of the restoration process, and, most importantly, copies of the messages between Walter and Marcus Thompson exposing the lies he had told during the sale. After obtaining the messages through Thompson, I had briefly considered taking legal action against Walter. Ava confirmed there were grounds for a misappropriation case. However, legal proceedings would be long, expensive, and uncertain. More importantly, they wouldn't bring me what I truly wanted: genuine acknowledgement of the meaning behind what had been taken. "Sometimes," my father once said during the grueling restoration of the Shelby's rear axle, "the only way to solve a problem is to face it head-on, no matter how intimidating it seems." I parked 2 blocks from the house, giving myself a few minutes to gather my thoughts. The Shelby's distinctive growl would be unmistakable long before I arrived, a sonic announcement impossible to ignore, exactly as planned. As I walked back toward the car, I mentally rehearsed the upcoming confrontation one last time. I wasn't aiming to humiliate Walter publicly, though he certainly deserved it. The goal was deeper, to force him to face the truth about his actions, dismantle the convenient narrative he had constructed, and, perhaps most importantly, show my mother exactly what kind of man she had chosen. I set clear boundaries for myself. Maintain unshakable composure regardless of any provocation, stick to concrete facts while avoiding emotional accusations, and offer a dignified exit if Walter showed genuine remorse. Unlikely, but possible. The Shelby's dashboard glowed softly, under the morning sun. I turned the key, and the engine awakened with that deep, throaty roar that never failed to send shivers down my spine. I maneuvered carefully through the residential streets, allowing myself to fully absorb the weight of every movement. This wasn't just a car I had recovered. It was a restored legacy, a promise fulfilled. As I turned onto the familiar street where I had grown up, I noticed several luxury cars parked outside. The prime clientele Walter catered to had already arrived. Perfect. Witnesses would only heighten the impact, especially considering how much reputation mattered in the high-end real estate world. I deliberately slowed down, letting the unmistakable rumble of the V8 engine announce my arrival. As I approached, I could already picture the scene that would unfold in the next few moments. The initial shock, the confusion, the recognition, and finally, the inevitable confrontation with the truth. I parked directly in the driveway, taking the central spot where Walter usually displayed his own luxury vehicle. The message was clear. I was reclaiming my place, not just as the rightful owner of the Shelby, but as the guardian of the legacy Walter had tried to erase. I took a deep breath before turning off the engine. The moment I had meticulously planned was finally here. And as my father always used to say at the end of a productive day in the garage, the real test isn't in the planning, Morgan. It's in the execution. The silence that followed was like the eye of a hurricane, a brief calm before the inevitable storm. I stepped out of the car with deliberately measured movements, leaning casually against the gleaming body as the house door swung open. Walter appeared first, his expression shifting rapidly from irritation at someone having parked in his private driveway to confusion and then to a pale recognition. Behind him, my mother froze in the doorway, one hand covering her mouth in shock. Walter's face, normally composed to exude unwavering confidence, now betrayed a barely concealed panic. It was the look of a man watching his carefully constructed house of lies crumble before his eyes. "Morgan?" he stammered, his voice losing that usual assuredness. "How did you... This can't be... It's exactly what it looks like," I replied calmly. "The 1967 Shelby Mustang GT500 that you illegally sold without my knowledge or consent, back in the hands of its rightful owner." Curious guests began gathering behind them, murmurs of confusion spreading as the unusual scene played out. I recognized some of the faces, important clients and business partners of Walter in the luxury real estate market. There must be some misunderstanding. Walter managed to regain some composure, forcing a tense smile as he clearly calculated how to contain the situation in front of his prestigious audience. "Let's discuss this privately, as a family." "Family?" The word hung in the air like an unspoken question. Family respects legacies, family honors commitments, family doesn't steal. My mother finally found her voice. "Morgan, please. The guests, they should know exactly what kind of business they're dealing with." I finished smoothly, opening my folder. Right here, I have full documentation showing how this car, left to me by my late father, was sold by Walter without legal authorization while I was working overseas. Walter stepped forward, trying to regain control of the narrative. "These are complicated family matters that are being misrepresented. The car had been sitting unused on the property for years. We simply made a practical decision that benefited everyone." "Everyone?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. "Or just you? Let's clarify some facts." I turned slightly, ensuring the intrigued onlookers were included in the conversation. "This Shelby Mustang was restored over 15 years by my father and me, even while he was undergoing terminal cancer treatment. On his deathbed, he formally left it to me as an inheritance." I took the photographs out of the folder, spreading them out for everyone to see. "Here we are, working together at every stage of the restoration. His last great joy before passing was seeing the project completed." Walter tried a new approach. "Morgan, obviously the car holds sentimental value. We understand that. That's why we set aside a generous amount for you after the sale." $5,000, I replied, letting the ridiculous amount hang in the air. "For a vehicle you sold for $175,000 to Marcus Thompson." A murmur rippled through the guests. The disparity was shocking, even for those who didn't fully grasp the emotional weight behind it. "How did you get it back?" my mother asked, her voice a mix of surprise and something that sounded almost like reluctant admiration. Unlike Walter, Marcus Thompson is a man of principles. When I showed him proof that the car had been sold without my authorization, he acknowledged the injustice. I paused deliberately. Of course, I still had to pay a substantial amount to get it back. "How much?" Walter asked abruptly, his broker's instinct calculating numbers automatically. "I invested every penny I had, sold essential equipment for my career, took on significant debt, all to reclaim something that never should have been taken from me." I looked straight at him. "The interesting part, Walter, is what I discovered in the process. I pulled out copies of the communications between him and Thompson. You didn't just sell my car without permission. You deliberately lied about its provenance, destroyed documentation that proved my ownership. And most revealing of all, you described it solely in terms of financial investment, never once mentioning its significance to the daughter of a man your wife loved for decades." The silence that followed was heavy, weighed down by the undeniable truth. Walter looked at the documents, then at the guests watching intently, and finally at my mother, whose face displayed a devastating mix of shame and belated realization. "Caroline." Walter turned to my mother, attempting to salvage his position. "You agreed to the sale. We explained to Morgan that it was for everyone's benefit. You told me Morgan had informally agreed, my mother replied, her voice surprisingly firm, that we just needed to finalize the details later. Another murmur rippled through the audience. The betrayal was deepening. An elegant woman I recognized as a prominent local real estate broker discreetly checked her watch. Walter, I think we should reschedule our discussion about the lakeside condo listing. Clearly you have family matters to attend to. Other guests began making similar moves, murmuring polite excuses as they slipped away. The carefully curated reputation Walter had built was unraveling in real time. This is ridiculous, Walter protested, his professional veneer completely crumbling. You're all letting a one-sided version distort your own correspondence. With Marcus Thompson confirms everything, I interrupted calmly. I'm not here to ruin your brunch or your reputation, Walter. I'm only here to establish the truth. What you did wasn't a lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated betrayal. The last guests trickled out, leaving just the three of us standing in the entryway, a broken family exposed under the unrelenting light of truth. Walter, finally grasping the full extent of the damage, dropped all pretenses. Do you have any idea what you just did? Years of building professional relationships, ruined. Interesting that your concern is for your professional relationships, not for what you did to your family, I noted. Ever since you stepped into this house, you've systematically erased every trace of my father, turned meaningful spaces into status displays, pushed me away with constant belittling remarks, and finally, when you thought I was too far to fight back, you sold the one thing I explicitly asked you to leave untouched. My mother stepped forward, silent tears streaming down her face. Morgan, I should have stopped it. I should have asked more, questioned more. You chose to believe what was convenient, I replied. Not cruelly, but without softening the truth. Just as you have since Walter came along. For a moment, I saw the woman my mother used to be, strong, perceptive, capable of independent judgment. The recognition in her eyes suggested that perhaps she too was remembering. What do you want, Morgan? Walter finally asked, his arrogance replaced by pragmatic calculation. Money, some sort of additional compensation. The question revealed how he still fundamentally didn't understand. To Walter, everything could be reduced to transactions, problems solved with the right payments, feelings appeased with material gestures. What I wanted was for you to understand what you took from me. Not just a valuable object, but an irreplaceable connection to my father. I opened the door of the Shelby, preparing to leave. But I see now that's impossible. You simply lack the ability to understand the value of things that can't be listed or sold. I got into the car, the familiar leather seat embracing me like a hug. Before closing the door, I cast one last look at my mother. The house I grew up in no longer exists. It's been redesigned, remodeled, erased, just like the memories you allowed to fade. But this car, this survived, and through it, everything my father stood for and taught me has survived too. I started the engine, its powerful roar echoing against the walls of the house I once called home. As I backed out, I saw two contrasting scenes in the rearview mirror. Walter, visibly calculating the cost of damage to his career and reputation, and my mother, watching the Shelby drive away with an expression that suggested she was finally seeing beyond the illusions she had embraced. For years, the repercussions of that confrontation rippled outward like waves disturbing once still waters. Initially turbulent and intense, they gradually settled into new patterns and realities. 2 weeks after I had shown up at the house, I received an unexpected message from my mother, asking to meet at a neutral cafe. She arrived alone, without Walter's influential presence beside her for the first time in years. I wanted you to know, she began, nervously twisting her teacup in her hands, that I've started the separation process. The surprise must have been evident on my face. It wasn't just about the car, she continued. It was seeing everything laid bare that day. The lies, the manipulation, how I allowed someone to belittle not just you, but also the memory of your father. Her gaze met mine, more direct and present than it had been in years. Little by little, I let Walter redefine my reality. Small concessions turned into bigger ones, until I could barely recognize my own life. Why did it take so long? I asked, the question escaping before I could hold it back. Fear, mostly, she admitted, surprising me with her honesty. Fear of being alone. Fear of realizing I had wasted years in a failed relationship. Walter was very skilled at making me feel like his opinions, his perspectives, were the only reasonable ones. That afternoon, we began the slow process of reconnecting. Not immediately as inseparable mother and daughter, but as two women honestly acknowledging past mistakes and exploring the possibility of a new kind of relationship. As for Walter, the professional consequences came faster than the personal ones. Two major clients canceled their contracts after witnessing his behavior, and rumors of his questionable conduct spread quickly through the exclusive real estate circles. Ironically, the man who valued appearances above all had lost precisely the carefully curated image he held so dear. Through my mother, I learned that Walter initially tried to deny any wrongdoing, insisting that I had over-dramatized everything and manipulated the situation. When confronted with concrete evidence that she finally examined thoroughly, his defense turned into a typical transactional offer, additional financial compensation, as if money could mend the fundamental breach of trust. When the divorce was finalized months later, another troubling layer was revealed. Walter had systematically isolated my mother from her financial resources, keeping her dependent while maintaining the appearance of generosity. With the help of a sharp attorney, she was able to regain her financial independence, and more importantly, her confidence in her own judgment. My first months with the restored Shelby were almost therapeutic. Every drive along coastal or mountainous roads felt like a reconnection with my father and the legacy I had nearly lost. The car was not just a vehicle, it was a portal to memories that grew more vivid with every mile. The photography project for Marcus Thompson turned out to be more than just a contractual obligation. Documenting his extraordinary collection of classic cars required weeks of meticulous work, capturing each vehicle in a way that highlighted not only its aesthetic beauty, but also its historical significance. Thompson, impressed by my technical understanding and artistic sensitivity, recommended me to other prominent collectors. "You have something most automotive photographers don't," he explained when he saw the final images. "You're not just capturing cars, you're capturing what they represent, the stories they carry." This realization crystallized a new direction for my career. Although I continued in photojournalism, I developed a parallel specialization in documenting historic automobiles and, more importantly, the people who dedicated their lives to preserving them. The project evolved into a photography book titled Mechanical Guardians: The People Who Preserve Automotive History, an indirect tribute to my father and others like him. Diego, whose support had been instrumental in restoring the Shelby, became a frequent collaborator on these expeditions. His technical expertise complemented my artistic vision, and eventually our partnership evolved into something more personal, a relationship built on shared values and mutual respect. "Your father would have approved," my mother remarked when I finally introduced Diego formally over dinner. "Not because he works with cars, but because he understands the value of things that cannot be replaced." On a sunny Sunday afternoon, about a year after the confrontation, I drove the Shelby to a scenic overlook my father had loved. My mother sat in the passenger seat, her first time in the car since my father had passed. "Your father and I had our first date in this car," she revealed, running her fingers reverently over the dashboard. Not this exact model, of course, but a 1967 Mustang he had partially restored. It was far from perfect: torn seats, uneven paint, a makeshift sound system. But he was so proud. She smiled at the memory. He told me that one day he would own a Shelby GT500. It seemed like an impossible dream back then. "And he did," I replied, feeling that invisible yet undeniable connection to my father, because he understood that some things are worth every hour of work, every dollar saved, every obstacle overcome. She paused, gazing at the landscape through the windshield. "When you pulled into that driveway with this car, I saw your father in you. Not just in your appearance, but in your determination, your refusal to accept that something truly important could be taken from you." We continued our journey, the Shelby's engine singing its unique melody as we traveled roads my father had driven decades before. Every curve, every gear shift was both a mechanical action and a moment of transcendent connection. The Shelby was never just a car to me. Even before nearly losing it, I understood its special significance. But the struggle to reclaim it fundamentally deepened my understanding of my father's legacy. The real value was not in the mechanical components, no matter how meticulously restored, but in the lessons he imparted through the process. Perseverance in the face of obstacles, attention to detail, and the realization that the most valuable things in life are rarely those with the highest market price. Walter never understood that. To him, the Shelby was merely a depreciating asset, taking up valuable space, representing an opportunity for quick financial gain. His inability to grasp values beyond monetary transactions was not just a personal failing, it was a tragedy shared by many who confuse price with worth. My relationship with my mother gradually evolved into something more authentic than it had been before. The wounds hadn't completely disappeared, but the honesty that emerged from the aftermath created a foundation for genuine connection. She found new independence after the divorce, eventually returning to teaching and rediscovering a sense of personal purpose. As for me, the Shelby remains the gravitational center of my life, not just as transportation or an object of admiration, but as a tangible reminder of a legacy that was nearly erased. The garage where I keep it has become a sanctuary, much like the one my father once created. Meticulously organized tools, technical manuals lining the shelves, and the comforting scent of grease and leather. Occasionally, young people in the Prat neighborhood stop to admire the car. When they ask how much it's worth or how fast it is, I share technical specs that satisfy their curiosity. But when someone asks about its story, like a particularly perceptive teenager did recently, I give the answer my father would have given. This car is a lesson about cherishing the things money can't buy, about fighting for what matters, even when it seems impossible, and above all, about how a true legacy isn't in the objects we leave behind, but in the values we pass on through them. When my stepfather sold the classic car I inherited from my dad, he thought he was simply getting rid of an inconvenient asset. What he didn't realize was that he was trying to sell something that could never truly belong to him. A legacy of love, knowledge, and connection that no monetary value could ever measure. By showing up as the new owner, I reclaimed more than a vehicle. I reclaimed a promise made to both my father and myself, that some inheritances are irreplaceable, and some bonds are too strong to be broken, even by those who fail to see their true worth.